Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to today's show with Manifesting Inclusion, good people. We're going to get into introductions in a second, but before we get started, we want to take the time to welcome you to our show. So, as you see, we have two wonderful panelists here today. They're going to be talking about educational equity and racial justice. And I heard we are getting the realest of the real. So, let's go through a couple of show notes and house rules. So, we ask first. You'll see some reaction buttons, or you'll be able to locate them down on the bottom of the screen. You'll see some clapping hands. You'll see a heart. You'll see some support button. At any time in the show, if you see something that resonates with you or really hits that special spot in talking about these topics, please show us and the guests some love. Second, you'll see that comment box. If something resonates with you and you're like, "Ooh, girl," or you want to ask a question at any point, please leave that in the comments as well as below. And last but not least, you will see a share button down at the bottom. Please share this conversation. Not only does it let folks know that you're engaging with this important work and thinking about how do we manifest inclusion, but also thinking about how are you engaging in your own professional development. And we love that. So, it is now time for our show. So welcome to today's show, good people. My name is Lee Miles. I love this work. We've been doing this for about almost a year now, Dr. G, and I'm one half of the Manifesting Inclusion team, and I work as the Associate Director of Inclusive Excellence at Wake Forest University. So I'll pass it over to my greater and better half, Dr. G.
Oh, you are way too kind. My name is Laura Gonzalez. I use she and her pronouns, and I am an educational consultant who focuses on immigrant and refugee issues as it relates to education, thriving, and manifesting inclusion. In addition to this wonderful speaker series that we're about to jump into in a second, Manifesting Inclusion also does some in-person conference presentations, and we've been working on a book project, which we're hoping to have ready to tell you more about in the coming months. And so our main goal is just to bring people together in a community to really talk about what are these ideas related to inclusion, and how do we not just talk about it, but make something happen? How do we manifest this better world where there is more equity and inclusion for all? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today with our guests. I would like to start with introductions, and we will begin with Kamille Bostick. If you would tell us a little bit about yourself today.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Kamille Bostick, and I'm the Director of Programming here at the Center for Racial Equity in Education, or CREED. And background, I do a lot of different things, y'all. And in my past, I was a journalist. I moved into teaching high school. And then from there, I was out at a museum as an educator, and have moved since then to working through like, how do we bring better writing skills to students from like my work at Livingstone. Shout out to the blueberries out there. To now working at CREED, where my focus really is saying like, how do we take the things that we understand about education equity and bring it back to the public so that our practitioners can use it and our students can benefit from it. Very excited to be here today to talk through education equity with my colleague, Dr. Jerry Wilson. So nice to meet everyone. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Go ahead and introduce yourself as well, Dr. Wilson.
All right, happy to be here. My name is Jerry Wilson. I serve as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at CREED. I used to teach high school social studies in Chicago for a little bit before going back to graduate school, but it definitely still is a passion of mine. It's how we go about the process of creating citizens and developing citizens from young people who are enrolled in public schools. Um, and what things do we teach them or fail to teach them that will make a difference in our multiracial democracy? So I'm happy to be here and talk about equity.
Marvelous. I am such a fan of the work that CREED does, and I hope that everyone who's listening already knows about CREED. But just in case there's somebody out there who doesn't, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the organization and the work that it does, and maybe what you're passionate about as far as CREED's mission and work. And we can start with Kamille.
Yeah, so CREED is an education equity nonprofit. We do statewide work. Our goal, of course, is to make sure that students, whether they're in pre-K all the way through college, their academic and their educational outcomes are not precipitated on their race, because we know that sometimes we don't want to say that race matters, but it does. And so Creed, through a lot of programming, engagement, implementation, thinking through how we can close the knowing doing gap. We do everything from working, thinking about policy and how the impacts it has on the classrooms and the teachers and the students, to ways we can advocate for different changes in that. We have all kinds of like groups and fellowships that we do. And of course, there's always teacher practice that we're trying to affect through professional development and ways to connect with teachers. So I think that in a nutshell is Creed.
Thank you, Kamille. I think Jerry has a task he needs to attend to right now, and so maybe we'll just, when he comes back, we'd love to hear about what he's passionate about in his work with Creed. But maybe we'll just continue for a minute with you, Kamille. How do you personally define educational equity? I know a lot of people like understand these words in the sort of like buzzy kind of way, but I appreciate the way you're focused on like the how does this look on the ground? So what does educational equity mean to you?
So I think, and if y'all don't mind, give me the ability to read this definition, which you think I would know by heart, but I am human and I don't know. But I want to read it, and then I'll tell you about like how I connect with it in other specific ways. So increased definition, right? We say that educational equity is achieved when there are educational policies, practices, and programs necessary to eliminate the barriers and ensure every student gets what they need in their classrooms and out of their education. And so I see that as saying specifically that equity, education equity, it is not just some destination that you get to. It's not only the noun part of it, but there's some action that has to go into it. And so we have to be intentional and making sure that when we understand what those barriers are, and that we work really hard to dismantle them, that we work really hard to disrupt all the patterns that are going into why our students, either if they're students of color, they're Black students, Latinx students, American Indian students, Asian students, are not getting the same outcomes at the same rates as many other students do, and specifically our white students in some cases, but not all cases, because sometimes you look at that data and you say, why is white the comparative person here? Because those students are not always the ones that are excelling. So I think just my connection to this work has really been, people say this, like we lament the problems. I grew up with the problems. Maybe I was one of the data points in the problem as a Black student in the South, though I was wonderfully made, right? That we can see kind of where the structures are, like who gets access to AP courses, or who's considered gifted, who's considered talented, who is able to get the certain discipline referrals, and who gets the other ones. There's so many things that we kind of see when it comes to inequity. And we've known these things. We think about like the literacy rate and the proficiency rate when it comes to reading and math, science even. We know this. There are people who could quote it. We see the headlines and it's kind of like, oh, I get another year of that thing. And then it really becomes like, how do we tackle it? We can talk about it. Sometimes you do need the awareness, but then there's also has to be, and I feel like Creed really gives me the ability to do this. Like there has to be the action on the ground. Like how do we actually change these outcomes? If we need more teachers, how do we get more teachers? If we need more teachers of color, how do we get more teachers of color? If we need better understanding of what learning differences do and how they impact students and their learning, then why are we not kind of making sure that our teachers getting that information and our parents understand how to navigate those systems? So I think for my particular vantage point, Creed really is thinking through, like there are people who have the knowledge, there are people who have the skills, and those are not always the same people. How do we bring them into rooms together, or into conversations together, and start to enact some of those changes that we need to see on the ground, so that we're not having this conversation 50 years from now? Because 50 years ago, we were having the same conversation, to be very, very honest.
Welcome back in, Jerry. We would love to also hear you say a little bit about what educational equity means to you. And I think advocacy is part of your job title too. And maybe you can tell us about what makes you feel passionate about advocacy related to educational equity.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think for me, something that I'm always reminded of is how deeply human education is, like the process of education. And like it's not an exaggeration to say that to live is to learn, right? Um, and I think it's also true that when we talk about education equity, we have to be honest that the barriers to equity are human made, right? Um, we're talking about some humans denying opportunity to other human beings. Um, so it's deeply relational in the problem itself, and I believe that approaches toward equity, toward addressing inequities, also have to be relational. And I think that Camille said it pretty well, but from my understanding, equity is making sure that every human being has what they need to thrive, right? Um, and I think it's important that we also understand that we can't say education equity as though it's separate from all the other types of equity, right? Because systems of oppression are interlocking, and they don't draw lines and say, okay, well you're going to be discriminated against until you leave school, and then you'll be fine when once you leave school grounds, you'll be fine in the world. That's not the way that inequities work. Um, so I think that if we're thinking about equity and what it means, we have to be conscious that students are people, and the problems in our society that discriminate, that deny opportunity, that marginalize, they affect people in lots of different ways. And so it's not always helpful to compartmentalize and say, well, we just want to focus on education equity. We don't care if you have a place to live. We don't care if you have food to eat when you leave here. We don't care if you're in an abusive situation. That's just not the reality for how human beings exist and live, and definitely not a path toward how human beings thrive. So I like to have a more holistic understanding of view of equity, and basically, from my understanding, it means human thriving, right? Creating the conditions for all human beings to thrive.
So let's dig into that for a second because this is a huge topic. So I went to an HBCU for undergrad, and then I went to Indiana University, which is 4% Black people. And it was the first time I think going to a predominantly Black high school, even though I was in the non-Black part in the STEM section of the school, that I had to think about equity in terms of my learning. So, why do you think that well, first, what do you think are some of the big issues when it comes to racial equity specifically? And what is that landscape? What are some of the systems? What are the pieces that we need to unearth? And I know that's a huge question, but for those that may or may not be familiar with the topic, like, what's the real deal? And we'll start with Camille.
I was hoping that it would not go to me, even though it can go to me. Um, so I think to your point of sometimes you don't have to think about it depending on where you are, but then you should be thinking about it no matter where you are, especially when it comes to racial inequity and its intersections with education. We can't not say that we're dealing with an education system that is built on like what America's built on, with a lot of ideals of like white supremacy and what that has meant, and kind of the way that it infiltrated what means like what we consider um, a good education, what it means to be considered smart, what it means to be considered, a good behaved student or a bad student. All of these things, like we're feeding, like it all comes down, like it is in the ground, and it feeds up in it, and we're bearing the fruit. We live it every day in every classroom, in every school, from pre-K all the way through college. So that is real, and I think some of the things that kind of I feel like our issues, and I want to name like the big ones. Yes, white supremacy is an issue. I think also complicity in a way. As people who talk to me, I say complicity a lot, and I do mean it. I feel like there are a lot of people who are okay with the status quo, And that is exactly why we have what we have, and we keep seeing kind of the repeated performance gaps that we're seeing when we're thinking about the discrepancies we see with discipline and this all of the things, right? And then I also understand that in that kind of complicity, people who are okay with the status quo, there are just as many maybe who are like not aware enough. Like they're walking around, and even though this is the stuff that we swim in and work in, like there's just not enough awareness to challenge it. Like, why are all of the advanced placement students in your, well, not all, why are the majority of the advanced placement students in your school, why do they look one particular race, right? When we go to colleges, like why do our classrooms look a certain way, and we teach certain ways? And if you don't question that, then you become a part of the problem while we still have these issues. And so I just see that complicity in both ways. Sometimes it's willful, and then sometimes it's not. But then we have to ask ourselves, why are we not paying attention to the thing? Now, there are other ways that, racial inequity show up in education. We can think about like what our teachers look like, who are on our school boards. Jerry, I know you can do a lot of talking about that part in particular. Thinking about what like the curriculum and the classrooms and the policymakers look like. But to me, I'll stick with those top two of we have some complicity going on, and then some white supremacy. And if you're okay with it, it's just going to keep manifesting itself.
Yeah, I think Kamille hit the nail on the head. I think for me, as a former social studies teacher, you know, I think that it's very obvious to me that we have a lot of people um, who have distorted views about the history of this country and our society, and that's important for lots of reasons, right? Particularly when we start talking about trying to address contemporary issues and challenges. Um, if we don't have a proper understanding of history and how we came to the place that we are today, it's very easy to misdiagnose an issue or a problem. I think that, there are some really harmful racist stereotypes that have made their way into curricula, that have made their way into classrooms, and that are floated around dinner tables every single night in this country, right? And that has an impact on how people view the world around them, how they view their peers, their classmates, and fellow human beings, and what they think they are capable of, right? Um, for an example, um, somebody might look at the underrepresentation of Black educators and say, well, I guess Black people just don't want to be teachers, right? But if you understand history, and fairly recent history, you understand that there's been, in some sense, a coordinated movement um, before and since Brown versus Board of Education to kind of push Black educators out of the classroom, right? A lot of times, people don't understand that, they don't know that history, and they're only looking at very recent realities, and they say, well, how did we get here? What does this mean? There must be a problem with blank marginalized group, right? But having a proper understanding of history helps us to be able to properly diagnose and address the issues that we seek to address. Now, like Kamille said, those are for the folks who are complicit unintentionally, right? People who are well meaning, who just don't have the information that they need to be able to address the problems and challenges surrounding equity. Now, there's a whole nother group of folks who use that disinformation and misinformation to their advantage to maintain um, status, right, and to denigrate other groups and other people. And the more folks who are educated and who have a proper understanding, um, the less likely the folks who only want to sow harm are to succeed. So that's the challenge that we face right now, and unfortunately, policymakers in a lot of states, North Carolina included, have decided that they would like to place restrictions on students' ability to learn accurate and honest history about this country and about the state where we live. So um, that requires all of us to really do everything that we can to make sure that students are getting honest, accurate education, not just students, but parents and grandparents and everyone, because the misinformation really does run deep.
Wow, thank you both. I really appreciate the depth and the breadth of what you've laid out for us to think about. And I also really appreciate the way you've identified a couple of different, kind of spaces people might be in as they are thinking about educational equity and therefore what their response should be. So, for instance, I know that you all have a teaching in color program where part of your goal is to really support teachers of color and to help them, feel to have representation so that students can also see that and to help those people feel like they can thrive professionally even against headwinds sometimes, as well as thinking about ways that other people can elevate their understanding and awareness and find the levers of power that they might be able to put their hands on to make some better policies or practices or programs. So what are some of those kinds of tools or resources that you'd like people to know about, either ones that Creed actively is working on or some other resources and tools you've come across in your work?
So, Jay, I don't know if you want to speak specifically about something in particular, but I think Cree sort of takes this angle of we can, put out policy briefs, which we do, and they just kind of outline particular issues that we're having. You mentioned our Teaching in Color network, which is for educators of color, to find supportive spaces and places. So along with like creating, I will say like cohorts or places that are like communities where people can go to be together, to learn together, to be supported. There's also the chance for folks who are just on the edges of it and want to learn more to kind of dive into it using the data and the expertise of folks who kind of study it every day. But we also have a lot of practitioner-based resources. If you go to the Creed website, I think it's actually under resources. We call like toolkits for teachers to think about how to, better equip themselves in for students who have learning differences. We connect with our partners who also do toolkits and share their resources. We have a large coalition called the Freedom Here Coalition that looks at the angle of education equity and education justice from many, many different angles and many, many different kind of community and approaches, anti-racist approaches, among others. And I will shout out that we have equity fellows. Folks, we have 10 months worth of people who are thinking through these issues and how they can, in their spaces and their spheres, create change. And it's just a lot of things that Creed does in terms of its public programming as well that says we want to invite you into this conversation, like join us at our education policy chat, or find a way to connect with us as we're kind of working on our social media to say, like, have you heard about this issue and how to engage with some of the things that are happening. So I think there's a lot of different ways that people can approach thinking about resources. And if you're not a reader, we have a podcast, right? If you're not a person who wants to like deep dive into all the hard data and see the graphs, then there's ways that we connect with folks who have dashboards so you can kind of see it simply. And then there's also the chance to just be in community with folks who are thinking about these issues, grappling with these issues, working through these issues every single day. So those are mine, I think. But Jerry, if there's anything you want to highlight, I definitely feel like you should.
Thank you for sharing those, Kamille. I think that is pretty much all the things that I would mention, but I would also say that just kind of the spirit behind teaching in color is a recognition that teachers are the most important school-related factor in student outcomes and how students experience school, but also how well they perform in school. Like the most significant school-related factor is educators. And a lot of research shows that educators of color have a profound impact on all students, but particularly students of color. So if we are focused on education equity, like you said, Dr. G, There's all sorts of incentive why we would focus on educators of color. Um, and I think it's also important to mention that educators of color go above and beyond a lot of times in ways that aren't recognized, right? In terms of promotion and in terms of pay, right? If you are mentoring several students after school, just out of the goodness of your heart and a desire to help students succeed, that doesn't show up in your paycheck, right? In fact, the time that you spent doing that was time you could have been spending at a part-time job, right? So in some ways, it's a tax to be an educator who cares, right? Who goes above and beyond for their students. And part of what we hope to do with Teaching in Color and Equity Fellows and some of the other initiatives that Kamille mentioned is just recognize that educators are champions, right? That they are difference makers. And currently, they're not adequately supported, right? So some of the resources and the initiatives that CREED has in place are really just to support, to keep folks in the classroom who are there doing amazing work and to build that supportive community around them and to encourage folks who are aspiring educators that it is worthwhile. There are a lot of challenges, right, to being an educator today, but it is worthwhile, and there's a whole lot of good that you can do.
So, Jerry, I have a question about that, and both of you all can chime in. But uh, I taught sixth grade for like a year, and I recognized that was not for me because it was going to be them or me, and it was not going to be me, right? And I didn't know about all the challenges that happened in a classroom, right? Everything from supplies to classroom management to what kind of team support do you have, right, or a cohort. For those that are not in education, what are some of those things that specifically for educators of color, like what does their life look like? So beyond the Abbott Elementary, what are those challenges and hurdles do they experience? And we'll start actually with Kamille and then go over to Jerry.
You should have let Jerry go first.
My
Uh,
bad, my bad.
no, I can go. I'm just messing with you. But um, I think, well, I will say one just for Abbott Elementary. I think those situations are real. Like I just watched the one that was about like ringworm, and I thought, oh my gosh, I used to hate sixth season. Even though I was a high school teacher, I was high school on purpose because these little people full of germs. I said, but even the things that they make light of are real issues that teachers have to deal with every day, except maybe you don't get the laugh out of it. You have to sit down and say, well, am I gonna cry this afternoon? I think from when I was in the classroom to what I hear teachers talk about now, a lot of the challenges really come from, it feels sometimes insurmountable because, as Jerry mentioned, like these are humans. Like you are a human and you are teaching other humans who have human issues. Like when you see a student and you're like, oh, I really want them to, enjoy whatever unit you've designed that took you all night, all weekend, the week before, they put together, and then they come into class and they haven't slept because their family's facing eviction. Like then you have to type what teachers say, like put on the social worker hat and like, well, how do I help my student deal with this? If the student's from a space where there's trauma in the home, like there's all these other things that you're like, oh, you're not just acting out because you're not reading on grade level, but you're also dealing with all these other things that you have to put down. Like I can't tell you to not think about what your mom is going through or your dad's going through to read this story about somebody else's mom, because that's not important, right, to you at that point. And if your student is hungry, what are you seeing when they're in the classroom there? So I feel like teachers just talk about the many roles and the ways they have to really, it's almost to this some point where you have to compartmentalize. Like, are we doing the lesson plan today, or are we doing like the life work today, and understanding that my students have that. And then there's also the pressure of everything being tested, and understanding like the pressures that the administration has to do. Like we need to see performance changes in the students and what they're prepared to do on all the things that tell you that the metrics are there. And I would say one last one that I just kind of think of when I think about teachers in our classrooms beyond like the human element of the students and the testing is just that I think there is often this deficit of like, if you are an educator who's gone through an educator preparation program, like you've gone and gotten your degree, like how does that actually show up in like what you're doing every day? Like, do you have enough tools to help the students that are in your classroom? And then if you're not and you're like lateral entry, then there's always this dynamic of, do I know enough about like, you know, the pedagogies of teaching so that I'm actually able to do the work that I want to do. So sometimes I think there's just that that gap of, am I ready for all the work that teaching entails? But then can I even do that work because there's so many other things coming in the building? So
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is I think there's some structures in place right now that are designed to make things more difficult for educators. So in North Carolina specifically, lawmakers a while back decided to end master's pay. So if you have gone to hone your craft, going back to graduate school to learn, to become a better educator, lawmakers have said, well, we're not going to pay you additional funds for that investment that you made in yourself, which was ultimately an investment in the children of North Carolina, right? Um, they've also said that once educators hit year 10, they're no longer going to receive annual pay increases. Um, and I think that that is a slap in the face when we say all the time that we need more experienced educators. For lawmakers to say that there's a certain point in your career, there's going to be a 10-year period, I'm sorry, year 15, from 15 to 25, where you won't receive those annual increases anymore, where you may be the most efficient and productive and awesome dynamic educator that you've ever been, and you are not being rewarded for that dedication that you've shown year after year. Um, so that's a penalty that policymakers have put on all educators in North Carolina. For educators of color specifically, there is the added challenge of like schools are places with people, and anywhere in this society, um, people of color are going to experience racism, right, and discrimination in different ways, and white supremacy. So, you know, you're in this position where you've been under resourced and been given a Herculean task that doesn't take into account all the challenges that you have in this role. And on top of that, you have to deal with um, what we call microaggressions, right? These small daily slights that you have to experience day in and day out, and keep going as though nothing ever happened, right? Because ultimately, um, educators choose to serve their students in a lot of cases. And it is, for some folks, they reach that point to where they got to make that choice, like you said, Lee, where it's either me or this job, right? And I can't be here and pour into students if I'm drained and empty myself. So there is a teaching to nursing pipeline that I've seen play out time and time again with many of my friends and classmates. It's real because if you have a passion for helping people, um, there are other ways to do it that get more respect and that haven't been denigrated by policymakers in the ways that educators have.
Jared, you call them like the microaggressions until they're not always micro. Sometimes they're like really big things that you're like, oh, you really are acting that because I'm black, that I don't have this expertise. Like, and how do you deal with that as an educator who is in a classroom and everybody seems to say like, you're good if you can do discipline, but don't come with a curriculum idea, So yeah.
I really appreciate what you all are saying about the additional weight that some folks are carrying that's disproportionate to what other people in the building are being asked to do. And it makes me think about the importance of strengthening the equity in the system so that it doesn't just fall onto one person, or also thinking about networks. So like ways that people tap into the networks, or other people like administrators or leaders in the building can also think about, their roles, or even, community members like, I'm a parent, my kids are in school, what does that mean as far as my investment in, what's happening in schools in a productive way. I think there's far too many parents trying to like tear down a system that's already, as you've said, overloaded. So I wonder what you think about, community partnerships, or, even networks within the buildings, networks with administrators, so that teachers don't have to feel all alone in this and don't have to feel like they're shouldering this enormous burden on behalf of the students. Either one of you can start with this one.
I was going to defer to you, Jerry. I'm letting you go.
Well, I'll say real quick. I think, yeah, that is absolutely, um, from my perspective, a winning strategy, not only for equity, but for enhancing um, the quality of education that students have, right? Um, we really have to make the community the classroom, right? Because there are resources within our communities that go unnoticed, and a lot of folks who never get the invitation. I always think back to, like, if you're teaching about civil rights, you know, how do you not have, you know, Mr. Johnson from down the street come in and speak to your students, right? Um, and I think, like, I recognize why that may be the case, because there are a lot of hurdles that you have to do to get there. Like, one, you have to have the relationship, right? So I think that's part of the work that teaching in color is beginning to try to do, is recognize that, again, this work is very relational, right? And we get better at doing what we do as educators by learning from other educators, right? By being in community and contact with experienced, uh, really, really amazing educators. So that's part of it, right? It's having those relationships so that you can reach out to the resources in the community to be able to materialize them for the students. And I think also about, like Kamille mentioned earlier, and so let me say, Kamille is a former museum staff person, right? Museums are great places for students to extend their education and their learning, particularly if it's on a subject that an educator might not have a lot of personal experience with, right? Some of my research looks at how likely educators are to bring certain topics into the classroom, into a social studies classroom. And what I found basically was that if it's a concept or an issue that an educator is not personally connected to, or that they feel some discomfort with, they're much less likely to bring it into the classroom, even if it's going to be empowering for certain students, right? But there are resources in the community, like museums, like nonprofit organizations, that will come in and speak to students and share this knowledge and information. And the last thing that I'll say on that is, I think that um, they're really, in this moment where diversity, equity, and inclusion are under attack, and school districts are adopting policies that really prevent educators and school district employees from doing the necessary work um, of creating welcoming, productive learning environments for all students. It's going to become essential for educators to be tapped into community organizations and resources and networks where their students can get the information and the affirmation that they need, right, to thrive. Um, Unfortunately, as we continue to head down this path, that's going to become even more crucial.
I agree. And I would just add to that, this idea that, if we're talking about public schools specifically, they are public, right? And that idea that you need to see, like our schools as a microcosm of society, teachers need the support of the communities that they are serving their students in so that they can make sure they are connecting to them and that they are being responsive to them. And the folks who are in those communities who, I know it's not to put the burden on some folks who are busy or might be disenfranchised, but if you have that opportunity, like connect with the teacher and support them, tell them that you support them. There's like, you can bring them muffins, but you also could just be like, if you need a resource, let me tell you about a person that I know, or about another community organization that exists that has the capacity to help you. Like, those connections are always very, very helpful. And sometimes when you, as a teacher, don't live in the community that you teach in, if that community can reach out to you, that can help kind of build some bridges. So I truly support the idea that our communities need more ways to connect to teachers, and teachers need more ways to connect to their communities, so that we're creating the magic that is, a public education system where not only can all students be served, but they can be impacted by all the things that are going on around them.
So I would like to take a second and talk about some community building pieces, right? So we are so grateful as a part of this project. One of our co-authors and one of our team members, Terry Chavis, and I presented at the Teaching in Color Summit, and that was such a wonderful experience. Not only to be around other educators and make connections, but we also had wonderful speakers, great vibes, and the opportunity to really connect with folks on the academic side, but also on the administrative side, right? So, can you tell us a little bit more about Teaching in Color as a recap for last year or previous years, and then potentially what you all think about the future dates as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here first. Yeah, so Teaching in Color is a community of educators. And in service to that community, we do a few different things. Two of the things that we do are really designed to try to uplift the voices and amplify the voices of educators of color. Uh, and those are Teaching in Color magazine, which you can find on our website, and the Teaching in Color mixtape, which is also on our website. We're working on the second editions of both of those right now. So if you know a dynamic educator of color that you think should be featured, please reach out to us and let us know. Also, if you are musical in any way and you want to contribute to the mixtape, reach out as well, because we believe in really amplifying those voices in ways that the public can get a better understanding of the experiences of educators of color, but also policymakers, right? A lot of times we tend to think that policymakers only care about numbers and statistics and data, but policymakers are also people, right? And people are moved by stories, stories of other people. And that's what we try to do with the magazine and the mixtape. We also have online monthly conversations. Each month there's a different topic or theme that we really break down and have real conversation and dialogue about. And then, of course, as you mentioned, we have our annual Teaching in Color Summit, which is typically in April, towards the end of April each year. This past year, we had a couple of new elements, right? We've been doing workshops each year. This was the third annual this past April. We've been doing workshops each year. We've been doing like a keynote address each year. But this year, we were very, very grateful to add Teaching in Color Educator of the Year awards, right? So we put out a call for nominations for dynamic educators of color. We got several and had to the difficult task of selecting three winners from that amazing list of educators of color from across North Carolina. We'll be doing that again this year. Be on the lookout for that nomination really soon. And we also had a research symposium as part of the summit, which brought uh, educators, students, and faculty, right? and staff on the higher education side together to talk about the intersection between race and education and several other issues as well. It was a really, really good experience and something we're excited to continue going into next year. And then, of course, you mentioned Abbott Elementary. We were really, really super excited to have for our guest speaker, Tyler James Williams, who plays Gregory Eddy on Abbott Elementary. And, you know, the theme for the summit was the roles we play, right? And we really drew that theme from research on the importance of educators of color. You know, the data shows that educators of color have this profound impact on all students, but particularly students of color. And there's lots of theories as to why that may be. There's like the role model hypothesis, which says that just being an educator of color inspires students of color to do better, right? And there's something to that. But we wanted to recognize that it's active labor on the part of educators of color that makes a difference, right? Um, it's a role that we play. And also just a nod to Tyler James Williams and all the work that he and the other cast of Abbott have done to uplift the stories of educators in this moment when public education is under attack. So we're super excited. We're going to start planning for next year's summit really, really soon. Um, I don't think we have any teasers or spoilers, do we, Kamille?
None yet, but it will be soon, and we're excited.
Well, as we're moving into just our last few minutes together, I just want to really encourage people who are listening to, stay on the lookout for that summit coming up in April. Check out the website to find out all these other resources and opportunities for, fellowship and learning and growing. So I'm just really grateful to both Dr. Wilson and Ms. Bostick for their time with us today. I think one of the things that I'm really, taking away for myself is that emphasis on the humanity of education as a process. And, I think as we've alluded to several times, we're kind of fighting against a tide right now of very dehumanizing influences, kind of depersonalization being part of white supremacy trick bag. And so, I just really want to encourage everyone who's listening to like hold on to your humanity and still be open to the humanity of all those around you. That there's so much more we can do when we like value and respect each other and can be in genuine conversation like we have been today. So thank you so much. As we close, Kamille and Jerry, would you be willing to let people know, where, in addition to the CREED website, they could find you if they'd like to have further conversation? And let's start with Kamille. Where can people find you?
Sure. I think I'm on LinkedIn, y'all. I don't even know where it is, but you type in Kamille Bostick, I should pop up. And then if you want to connect with me about CREED specifically, the email is camille@creed-nc.org. So feel free to email me, drop me a line. And this was a really good conversation. And I want folks, whether they are educators or if they're parents of students, if they're just community members, to just make sure that you are paying attention to what's happening in and with public education, because it is like a thing that we all need to be invested in so that we get the best outcomes for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I am on Twitter/X at Jerry J. Wilson. Um, I'm not super active like I used to be, but I dabble. And Creed, our socials are on our website. It's typically Creed_NC. So we're happy to engage there. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Whether you're joining us live here today, October 24th, 2024, or you're joining us in 2039, we hope that you've taken something away from this conversation. Before we close out, we want to announce that we have a couple upcoming shows. So if you're here with us every single week at 1 o'clock, we won't be streaming next week. However, we will be back Thursday, November 7th, and then again Thursday, November 14th. So those conversations will be talking about victim advocacy on the 7th. And on the 14th, we'll be talking about how to support inclusive spaces in residential life and higher education, specifically around living learning communities. So thank you so much, Kamille and Jerry, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing the comments and the mini gems that you all continue to drop, not only just here on this show, but again in your future work. So thank you for being here, and we can't wait to see you all next week. Have a great one, good people. Bye now.